Night had settled over the Wolfschanz Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters like a suffocating shroud. The pines stood motionless in the freezing air, and only the glow from the bunker windows suggested life inside the reinforced labyrinth. It was early winter, 1942. Did December the moment? Historians quietly point to as the hinge on which the fate of the Third Reich began to turn. Inside, the silence was broken only by the scratch of boots, the click of a typewriter, and the faint hum of a radio receiver dispatching reports from a front stretching thousands of kilometers. Generals came and went, their faces pale, their red-rimmed eyes revealing the weight of a reality they dared not speak to bluntly. The Soviet Union had absorbed everything. Germany had thrown at Itan, was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to die. Hitler sat hunched over a large operations map, the shadow of his body forming twisted shapes on the concrete wall. For months, he had insisted that a few more weeks would collapse Soviet resistance. But tonight, the reports carried a different tone, one that even he could not ignore. The Soviet counteroffensive around Stalingrad had begun in earnest. The Red Army thought, broken, depleted. Defeated had encircled the German Sixth Army, not merely resisting but striking with calculated ferocity. Guderian and Manstein had warned him about overstretching the lines, about ignoring logistics, about winter. Yet Hitler's belief in his own intuition had overridden them all. Now the reports spoke of Soviet divisions appearing from forced German reconnaissance claimed were empty. Entire Soviet Armeestadt destroyed were resurfacing, replenished, reorganized, and commanded with ruthless precision. Hitler read again the words he despised. The enemy is not collapsing. The enemy is growing stronger. He gripped the table's edge. His knuckles whitened. For the first time since launching Operation Barbarossa, Hitler felt something he had spent his life denying: doubt. Field Marshal Keitel entered quietly, carrying yet another report, this one from Army Group Center. Hitler didn't look up. He simply whispered, "More bad news." Keitel paused too long. His silence spoke louder than any words. Outside, the temperature dropped below freezing. Inside, for the first time in months, Hitler understood the scale of what lay before him. It wasn't simply that the Soviet Union had not collapsed. It was that it would not. Not tonight. Not in spring. Perhaps never. And the first crack appeared in Hitler's conviction. The night was far from over. The large Eastern Front map dominated the Central War rumen, the enormous spread of terrain dotted with colored pins and blue pencil strokes, indicating rivers, roads, railways, and cities. It was the physical embodiment of Operation Bal. The grand strategy Hitler believed would crown his empire with unstoppable victory. But tonight, the map looked different. It didn't radiate potential. It radiated warning. Hitler stood in front of it alone, tracing the long arc of German forces from Leningrad in the north, down through the frozen expanses of Smolensk to the blood-soaked ruins of Stalingrad. His finger hovered over the Volga River's obsession for months. He had believed that capturing Stalingrad would break the USSR's will and sever its logistical arteries. Instead, it had become a graveyard. Pincers that should have closed around fleeing Soviet armies were stretched thin, exposed, brittle. Soviet arrows, on the map, marked in red, now pierced deep behind German lines, hitting railheads, communications hubs, and weak flanks held by poorly equipped allies. Hitler stared at the red arrows for a long time. They were more than symbols. They were omens. Signs that the enemy he had called degenerate and inferior had reorganized into a force capable of matching and, in some sectors, surpassing development. He remembered the beginning of Barbarossa, the columns of panzers, the thousands of aircraft, the rapid advances, the glow of burning Soviet supply depots lighting up the night sky. Back then, he had spoken confidently to his generals. The Soviet Union will fall like a house of cards, but the house had not fallen. It had grown fangs. Hitler reached toward a region south of Moscow. The blue German lines there had hardly moved in months. The advancements that once stretched 50 kilometers in a single day now struggled to gain a few hundred meters. Supply shortages, fuel, ammunition, winter clothing were bleeding the army faster than enemy fire. For the first time, Hitler saw Barbarossa as a broken creature, a magnificent predator that had outrun its own legs. He stepped back. Everything he had built, everything he had gambled, rested on the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. But as the red arrows advanced deeper into German-held territory, the truth sharpened like a knife. Barbarossa had failed, and the map silent. Still, merciless was the first to show it. By midnight, Hitler's senior staff gathered reluctantly in the main conference room. The air hung heavy with cigarette smoke and dread. This was not a routine meeting, this was a confession. For months, Hitler had silenced dissent through intimidation, humiliation, and outright fury. But tonight, even his most loyal commander sensed that the illusion could no longer be maintained. General Zeitzler cleared his throat first. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The Sixth Army cannot break out, nor can we relieve them. The Soviets have committed overwhelming strength. Hitler closed his eyes. He had heard it before, but hearing it again, tonight, felt different. Keitel, usually Hitler's unwavering echo, hesitated before speaking. The situation is deteriorating across the southern front. Hitler snapped. Deteriorating or collapsing? Silence. Then Manstein's message was read aloud. Tog absent, his words cut sharply. The Soviet Union is not on the brink of defeat. They are preparing for larger operations. We must consider the possibility that we underestimated their reserves. Underestimated. Hitler hated that word. It implied heroes. General Jodl added quietly, intercepts show new Soviet divisions arriving from beyond the Urals. Fresh. Fully equipped. Fresh. The word struck Hitler like an insult. With a shaking hand, he tapped the edge of the table. How many divisions? Dozens. Perhaps more. The number is increasing daily. Hitler leaned back. Hours earlier, he still believed Germany could regain the initiative. But now, the truth spoken by the very men he trusted pressed suffocatingly close. Then came the final blow. General Zeitzler read the report from Army Group Center. Russian troop strength now exceeds our estimates by over 2 million. Their industrial output continues to rise. Hitler's face froze. Soviet output. Soviet manpower. Soviet resilience. 3 pillars he had believed were impossible to sustain. He rose abruptly from his chair. Enough. These figures are exaggerated. They must be. Stalin cannot possibly field such forces. No one answered, because they all knew the truth. He already had. Wehrmacht, once the most formidable land army on Earth, was being ground down not by Soviet weakness, but by Soviet endurance. Hitler dismissed the room. His voice was low, trembling not with fear, but with a cold beginning of realization. Tonight, for the first time, the unthinkable had been spoken aloud. After the generals left, Hitler moved to a solitary table where foreign intelligence reports lay scattered. He sifted through them mechanically, but each new piece of information felt like a deeper wound. The Soviet Union, he had imagined the one built on propaganda and racist ideology, was a brittle construct. Weak leadership, chaotic supply chains, incompetent officers, starving soldiers. Barbarossa had been planned on these assumptions. But the reality staring back at him now was something altogether different. He read the decrypted Soviet transmissions from the Stalingrad sector. They spoke of coordinated movement, strict discipline, and relentless morale. Entire units rotated seamlessly from front lines to reserves, as if part of a vast, well-oiled machine. This wasn't the Red Army of 1941. This was something new, something engineered by desperation, patriotism, and an astonishing capacity for sacrifice. Factories in the Urals were producing tanks faster than German factories could destroy them. Soviet engineers, thought primitive, were refining the T-34 into a weapon of terrifying efficiency. Women, children, elderly, all mobilized, all working. It defied everything Hitler believed. He read a captured Soviet political officer's diary. The entries were defiant, almost feverish in determination. We fight not for Stalin alone, But because the motherland cannot be allowed to fall, every family has buried someone. There is no going back. No going back, he repeated softly. He realized then that he had not understood the Russian soul. He had underestimated what a nation fighting for survival, burning its own cities, flooding its own land, sacrificing millions could endure. For months, he had ridiculed Soviet morale. Now he saw it for what it was. The backbone of a giant that refused to break. He turned a page. A German report summarized Soviet production. Their winter clothing stores exceed our own by a substantial margin. Winter, the bane of every conqueror of Russia. Hitler had dismissed its ordered troops forward with summer uniforms and sub-zero temperatures. He had trusted speed over preparation. The Soviets trusted patience. And patience was winning. The file slipped from his hands. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the bunker shrinking, the war tightening its grip around his neck. The Soviet Union had not merely survived. It had evolved, and Hitler realized he had awakened not a dying empire, but a giant that had only just begun to stand. He returned to the Stalingrad reports, unable to ignore them any longer. Stalin, Grad Hitler's obsession, his symbol of destiny, had become a monstrous vortex, swallowing tens of thousands of German soldiers. Early summer dispatches had promised victory. Late autumn reports predicted, and now winter reports confirmed catastrophe. Hitler replayed his earlier arrogance in his mind. They will not break. There will be no retreat. But the Soviets had turned Stalingrad into a trap, a masterstroke of deception and timing. While German divisions fought block by block, bombed building by building, Soviet armies gathered on the flanks quietly, invisibly. Hitler had dismissed warnings. Romanian and Italian allies were stretched thin. Fuel was low. Ammunition was dwindling. He insisted the Soviets had no strength left. Then came Operation Urals, a burst of Soviet fury unleashed in icy November wind. Now, the Sixth Army, Germany's pride, its symbol of invincibility, was encircled, starving, freezing. Their desperate pleas echoed through the radio lines. No food, no fuel. Casualties, unsustainable. Request breakout authorization. Hitler refused. He demanded they stand and fight, believing relief forces could reach them. But now, tonight, the reports in his hand were no longer requests. They were death sentences. Read Pulu's latest message. We cannot hold. If relief does not arrive, the army will be annihilated. Hitler muttered to himself. Impossible. Impossible. The Soviets should not have this strength. The Soviets should not, but they did. Stalingrad was no longer a battle. It was a reckoning. Everything Hitler had gambled on, speed, shock, ideology, was collapsing in the dust of a city he could not fully conquer. He gripped the report so tightly that the paper crumpled. The truth was undeniable. If the Sixth Army fell, the Eastern Front would bleed from a wound too deep to heal. He looked again at the map. The red circle around Stalingrad, Soviet encircled men, felt like a noose tightening around his empire. He whispered the question he had never dared ask. What if we cannot win? And for the first time, the silence answered honestly. Around 2:30 a.m., Hitler retreated into his private study. A cramped room lined with books and maps, its air stale from weeks of confinement. He shut the door, leaving the war room behind. In this small sanctuary, he often sought solitude, but tonight, solitude felt like exposure. He removed his gloves and stared at his hands. They trembled, not from cold, but from something far more dangerous. Clarity. He sank into a chair and stared at a portrait of Frederick the Great. 4 years. He had modeled himself on the Prussian king, the daring commander who snatched victory from inevitable defeat. Hitler believed he could do the same, that willpower alone could reshape reality. But he was beginning to see what his generals had known for months. He was no Frederick, and the Soviet Union was no brittle enemy. His mind replayed the calculations. Barbarossa had been designed for a 10-week campaign. The Wehrmacht had not prepared for winter warfare. Fuel reserves were evaporating. Ammunition stockpiles were strained. He had expected Soviet cities to fall like dominoes. Instead, the Soviets had burned their own lands, relocated their factories, and thrown millions into the fight. He whispered, "Where did I miscalculate?" It was a question he had never asked aloud. He remembered dismissing Holder's concerns, ignoring logistics officers, firing generals who warned him that the Soviet Union's depth and manpower made quick victory impossible. He remembered mocking the idea that Soviet industry could recover. Now he knew. The factories in the Urals were the empire's beating heart, and they were alive, producing tanks, shells, planes faster than Germany could destroy them. Hitler pressed his palms against his temples. His temples throbbed with the weight of realization. This war is not proceeding according to plan. The understatement was almost laughable. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider a forbidden thought. What if the Soviet Union cannot be defeated? The words tasted like poison. His ideology, his strategy, his entire worldview depended on the Soviet collapse. But the Soviet Union had not collapsed, and the winter night had no mercy for illusions. A courier arrived at 3:05 a.m. with a sealed intelligence report from Moscow. Hitler opened it impatiently, expecting routine information. Instead, the contents froze him. Soviet radio broadcasts, normally predictable propaganda, were unusually coordinated. Statements from high-ranking Soviet officials projected absolute confidence. Industrial data, intelligence estimates, and even intercepted German communications revealed something alarming. The Soviet government believed victory was inevitable. Hitler read the line twice. The enemy expects to reach Berlin in the future. It felt like a personal insult. He read further. New Soviet tank brigades formed. Fighter aircraft production increased by 30%. Replacement troops fully supplied with winter gear. Further reserves in Siberia not yet deployed. Hitler whispered, "Siberia, still. How many more?" The report didn't estimate numbers. It admitted German intelligence had no clear idea. That uncertainty terrified him more than any statistic. For months, his generals had tried to warn him that Soviet manpower seemed limitless, but Hitler refused to believe it. He believed Soviet soldiers would eventually despair, that their morale would crack under relentless losses. But now, tonight's reports revealed the opposite. Morale was rising. Production was rising. Mobilization was accelerating. This wasn't a dying empire. This was an empire awakening. Hitler stood and paced across the room. His movements grew erratic, agitated. The courier remained frozen at attention, afraid to speak or leave. Suddenly, Hitler slammed his fist on the table. They should have collapsed. Their economy was weak, their leadership incompetent, their people exhausted. They should have collapsed, but they didn't. The Soviet Union had absorbed near fatal blows and adapted. Each defeat made them stronger. Each German advance deepened their resolve. The report concluded with a chilling note. Red Army preparing for further winter offensives on multiple fronts. Hitler dropped the papers. They scattered across the floor like fallen snow. It hit him then, not as a sudden blow, but as a slew. Crushing weight. The Soviet Union was not fighting for Stalin. It was fighting for survival. And any nation fighting for its very existence could not be conquered by lightning strikes or ideological certainty. Hitler turned toward the darkened window. Beyond it lay the frozen forests of East Prussia, stretching endlessly into a night that suddenly felt eternal. The war he thought he understood had transformed into something far bigger and far more deadly than he ever imagined. Hitler moved back into the main war room, where the economic charts weighted documents he had ignored for months. The truth they carried was not ideological, not emotional, not debatable. It was mathematical. And tonight, mathematics was his enemy. Germany's resources were finite. The Soviet Union's seemed bottomless. He reviewed the fuel charts first. Romania's Ploiesti oil fields were overstretched, and Allied bombings were increasing. Fuel shipments had dropped by nearly 40%. Panzer divisions were rationing movement, sometimes immobilized entirely. Then came ammunition. German factories were producing less artillery than Soviet factories. Their shell stockpiles were dwindling faster than they could be replenished. Meanwhile, Soviet productionists, especially in the Urals, was rising steadily. Hitler clenched his fists. He moved to manpower German losses. In 1942 were catastrophic. Entire divisions had been worn down, rebuilt, worn down again. Meanwhile, Soviet conscription continued relentlessly, their population dwarfing Germany's. He stared at the numbers again and again, hoping they would change. They didn't. He whispered. We cannot outproduce them. The admission hung in the air like an execution sentence. He slammed the folder shut, not because the information was wrong, but because it was right. Next came geography. The Eastern Front stretched over 2,000 kilometers. Maintaining supply lines across such a monstrous distance required trucks, horses, rails, things Germany lacked. Yet the Soviet supply lines grew shorter as they retreated, then stabilized, then surged west again. Germany's advantages, speed, logistics, concentration were evaporating. Then came the most damning chart of all. Soviet factory output increased day after, losing Western territories. Hitler muttered. Impossible, cities burnet. Industry destroyed. How? He stopped. He knew the answer. Soviets dismantled factories piece by piece and shipped them east beyond German reach. An unimaginable feat that Germany never believed they could accomplish. But they had. The more he studied the charts, the more he realized he had not lost a Soviet strategy. He had lost to Soviet endurance. Endurance. Germany could not match. Endurance he never planned for. Endurance he never believed existed. As he stared into the abyss of numbers, Hitler finally understood the truth. This war could no longer be won by force, not against an enemy that refused to break. It was nearing dawn. The bunker air tasted stale, heavy with the scent of old paper and cold concrete. Hitler stood alone at the center of the room, staring at a single line on the map of front, bent backward, sagging under the weight of Soviet pressure. This, he realized, was the shape of failure. For hours he had reviewed reports, maps, statistics, diaries, intercepted transmissions, each a splinter, driving deeper into his confidence. Now, the final blow came in the form of a simple weather update. The winter of 1942 was predicted to be even harsher than the winter before. That alone could break Hitler felt a tremor, an involuntary shudder of recognition. Not fear, not even rage. Recognition, the kind that comes when reality finally pierces delusion. He sat down slowly, as if defeated by gravity itself. He whispered words no one would hear. This war cannot be won in the East. He didn't say the Soviet Union would win. He couldn't say that. Not even to himself. But he knew the truth. Germany could not win. He felt a strange sensation, not relief, not terror, but emptiness. The emptiness of a gambler who realizes the game is lost but continues playing out of pride, ego, and desperation. He remembered a boast he had made only months earlier. Once the Soviet Union falls, the world is ours. But the Soviet Union had not fallen, and the world was drifting away. He thought of past victories: Poland, France, the Balkans campaigns that had fed the myth of his invincibility. Now that myth was dissolving like smoke. The Red Army was advancing. The Allies were growing stronger. His trusted commanders were losing faith. Hitler rose and approached the window, watching the faint glow of dawn. The forest stood silent, indifferent, just as Russia had been indifferent to his expectations. He knew what awaited him. Years, more fighting. Millions more deaths. A slow, grinding defeat, dressed up as stubborn resistance. But surrender. Admitting defeat. Untincable. Untincable. Hitler would never confess what he now understood. Not to his generals, not to the German people, not even to his closest confidants. History would remember him as delusional for fighting a war he had already lost. But the truth was darker. He realized the Soviet Union would never fall, and deliberately chose denial. That was the night Germany's fate was sealed. When Hitler finally emerged from his private rooms, the bunker was stirring. Staff officers moved briskly. Phones rang. Messages crackled over radios. No one knew what had unfolded in the night. No. One saw the moment Hitler's certainty shattered, but the consequences would define the rest of the war. He gathered his generals for a morning briefing. His face was pale, his eyes dark, but his voice when he spoke forced itself into confidence. He declared that Stalingrad must be held at all costs. He insisted the Soviets were near breaking. He claimed that German willpower would decide the outcome. It was a performance, a mask. But those who knew him best recognized something had changed. The manic certainty was gone. In its place was brittle defiance and emperor, pretending his empire was not crumbling. For the rest of the war, Hitler clung to the idea of holding ground at all costs. Not because he believed in victory, but because he could not psychologically accept strategic retreat. The night he realized the Soviet Union would never fall was also the night he chained Germany to a war it could no longer win. His decisions became increasingly erratic. He blamed generals, weather, equipment, anything, except his own miscalculations. The consequences were catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands died at Army Group Center was annihilated in 1944. German civilians endured bombings, starvation, and occupation. Millions across Europe paid for Hitler's inability to confront his own failure. But the most tragic result was this. The war continued long after Hitler knew he could not win it. He died in 1945. The ruins of Berlin collapsing around him, still insisting victory was possible. But historians look back to a different moment. Not the bunker in Berlin. Not the failed offensives of 1944. Not even the collapse of Stalin. They look to a cold night in winter, deep inside a forest in East Prussia. A night when the truth finally reached Hitler, and he turned away from it. That night sealed Germany's fate. That night changed the world. That night proved a chilling reality. Great empires often fall not when they are defeated, but when their leaders realize defeat is inevitable and refuse to stop the bleeding.